The letter sat on Caleb Morgan's kitchen table for 6 days before he read it a second time. Not because he'd forgotten it, because the first time he'd read it, his hands had started shaking, and Caleb Morgan did not shake. He was a man who buried things. His father, his mother, 2 cattle seasons that should have killed the ranch and didn't. He buried them all in work and silence and kept moving. But this letter named a date, a train, a woman, and no amount of fence hammering in the world was going to change what was coming. If this story already has you feeling something, please subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and follow along until the very last word. And drop a comment below, telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Evelyn Hart's train was due. Caleb Morgan didn't sleep. He'd been awake since 3, sitting at the kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee and his father's pocket watch open in his palm, watching the minute hand like it owed him something. Outside, the summer heat had already started. Even before sunrise, the air pressed down like a wet wool blanket, thick and suffocating and mean. Montana in July had no mercy for anything it didn't have to be merciful toward. His foreman, Pete Dunbar, knocked twice on the doorframe at 5:30. "You want me to ride with you to the station?" "No." "Caleb." "I said no." Pete didn't push. In 11 years of working the Morgan Ranch, he'd learned that Caleb said a thing once, maybe twice if he liked you, and after that the conversation was finished. Pete pulled his hat down and walked back out into the heat without another word. Caleb sat alone a while longer. Then he stood, poured the cold coffee into the sink, and put on his clean shirt. The one without the work stains. The one his mother had given him 12 years ago that he'd never once worn because he'd never once had occasion to. He wore it now. Not because he wanted to impress her. Because she was coming to be his wife, and some things a man did out of basic decency, whether he felt like it or not. He told himself that several times on the ride to Millhaven. Chapter. The train station was 4 miles from the ranch. Caleb made it in 35 minutes, tied his horse to the post outside, and stood on the platform with his hat in his hands and his jaw set hard. 3 other men stood nearby. Colson, who ran the feed store. Henderson, who owned the hotel. And old Garrett, who just seemed to appear everywhere without reason or invitation, like a bad smell or a particularly stubborn weed. All 3 were watching Caleb with the kind of sideways, unhurried interest that men in small towns had perfected over generations. "Heard you sent for a bride," Colson said, not even pretending to mind his own business. "You heard right," Caleb said. "From Chicago. That's what the agency letter said." Henderson made a slow, skeptical sound. "City woman. Gonna be quite an adjustment, for both of you." Caleb didn't answer. He put his hat back on and looked down the tracks. The train was 6 minutes late. He counted every single one. When it finally pulled in, iron groaning steam, hissing in the brutal morning heat, Caleb straightened his spine and made himself ready. He had a clear picture in his mind of how the next few minutes would go. A modest woman, perhaps, nervous, grateful to see someone waiting. She would understand without needing to be told that this was a practical arrangement. 2 people choosing survival over solitude. She would be quiet, sensible. She would step into this life the way sensible people stepped into all necessary things. Without drama, without fuss. He was absolutely certain of every word of it. He was wrong about every single one. The woman who stepped off the train was not nervous. She carried 2 leather suitcases, one in each hand, and a long flat case strapped across her back that Caleb couldn't immediately identify. Her dark hair was pinned up in a way that had clearly started the morning organized and refused to fully surrender to the 11-hour train journey. Her traveling dress was dark blue, the hem dusty from travel, the cuffs slightly frayed at the edges. But she wore it the way some women wore silk, like it was simply the obvious choice, and everything else could adjust accordingly. She stepped onto the platform and stopped. She looked at him, not with uncertainty, not with the careful sideways caution a woman usually exercised around an unknown man. She looked at him the way a foreman assessed a new piece of equipment. Methodical, patient, like she was already filing things away. Caleb opened his mouth. She spoke first. "You're Caleb Morgan," she said. Not a question. "I am," he said. "Evelyn Hart." She set one suitcase down and extended her right hand firm, direct the way men shook hands, not the way women usually offered their fingers to be taken. "I expected you to be taller." The silence that dropped over that platform was the kind you could have cut with a boot knife. Coulson made a sound that was almost certainly a laugh swallowed wrong. Henderson turned away to address something urgent on the horizon that hadn't been there a moment before. Old Garrett simply smiled like a man watching his favorite kind of theater. Caleb stared at her. "I beg your pardon?" he said. "Your letter stated 6 feet," she said, picking her suitcase back up without missing a beat. "You're 5'11" at best. It's a minor discrepancy. I'm noting it because I intend to be precise in all things from the beginning, and I would appreciate the same courtesy in return." She looked down briefly at his feet. "Also, those are your good boots, not your work boots. You dressed for an impression this morning, which tells me you care what I think, which tells me we have something to work with." She looked back up. "Where is your wagon?" Caleb had not spoken. He was not entirely certain he was capable of speech. "Mr. Morgan," she said patiently, the way one might address a person who required a moment to catch up. "The wagon." "I rode," he said. "You rode. Horse." "One horse." "Yes." She looked at his horse. She looked at her 2 suitcases and the case across her back. She looked at the Montana sky bearing down on them, white-hot and pitiless. Then she returned her eyes to him with an expression that contained unmistakably something very close to pity. "Well," she said, "I suppose we'll manage." Dag. They managed. It was not graceful. Caleb tied the suitcases to the saddle with rope and walked the horse the full 4 miles. Evelyn walked beside him in the Montana summer heat without a single word of complaint. She asked questions the entire way. Not small talk, not pleasantries, but real questions, delivered rapid and clear, like she was working methodically through a list she had prepared in advance. "How many head of cattle?" 212. "Water source?" "Creek runs through the east pasture, fed by mountain runoff." "How far to the nearest doctor?" He glanced at her sideways. 18 miles. "Nearest town with a general store?" "Millhaven, 4 miles back." "You have a root cellar?" "I do." "A smokehouse?" "Yes." "Any hired men sleeping on the property?" "Pete Dunbar lives in the bunkhouse. 3 other hands ride in daily." She nodded, absorbing all of it without pause. Then, "Do you read?" He slowed his pace slightly. "Do I what?" "Read. Books. Do you do it?" "I know how to read," he said. "That wasn't what I asked." He didn't answer for a long moment. "Not much," he admitted finally. "Not lately." She made a small sound. Not judgment exactly. Not understanding either. Something precisely in between. "Do you have books in the house?" she asked. "My mother left some." "Good. I brought more." She adjusted the strap of the flat case on her back. "And this." "What's in that case?" "My violin." Caleb stopped walking. His horse stopped with him. "Your—" he started. "My violin," she said again, clearly as though the word were perfectly ordinary. "I've played since I was 6 years old. I play every evening. I'm telling you now so there are no misunderstandings later." He stared at her. "Miss Hart, this is a cattle ranch, not a concert hall." "Yes," she agreed pleasantly. "I had noticed that. Nevertheless." She kept walking. After a moment that felt longer than it was, Caleb followed. Pete Dunbar and 2 of the ranch hands were standing near the fence when they arrived. Not working. Standing. All 3 hats in hand, all 3 faces arranged in the careful neutral expression of men who had been told something was coming and were now confronting the fact that they had not been told enough. "Miss Hart," Pete said, tipping his head with genuine respect. "Mr. Dunbar," Evelyn said. She had somehow already learned his name. Pete blinked. "The fence post on the east side of the barn," she said, How long has it been sinking? Pete looked at Caleb. Caleb's expression offered nothing. Pete looked back at Evelyn. The middle one, ma'am, couple months, I reckon. We've been meaning to get around to it. If it isn't reset before August, you'll lose 2 more on either side from the ground shift, she said. I'll look at it tomorrow. She picked up both suitcases. At the door of the house, she stopped. Does the kitchen stove draw properly? Mostly, Pete said. Mostly, she repeated in a tone that suggested she and the word mostly would be having a private conversation later. Then she went inside. There was a long silence on the porch. Lord Almighty, said the younger of the 2 ranch hands, just barely under his breath. Caleb looked at him. The young man found something important to do on the far side of the barn. Inside, Caleb showed her where things were. She walked through every room the same way she'd walked through everything else, taking stock. She opened cupboards, checked the stove flue, ran her hand along the kitchen table like she was measuring it, crouched and looked under the dry sink, tested the window latches. Caleb stood in the doorway with his arms crossed and the clear sensation that his own house was being evaluated. Your salt pork will last 3 weeks, she said, straightening up. After that, you'll need to smoke more or ride to Millhaven. Your flour is down to 1/3 of the barrel, and you're entirely out of vinegar, which is going to create problems for food preservation in August heat. I was managing fine, he said. I didn't say you weren't. She opened one of her suitcases on the kitchen table and began unpacking with brisk, organized efficiency. Books to one side, a carefully wrapped tin box onto the counter, clothing folded with precision. I'm establishing a baseline. I need to understand what's already working before I touch anything. You're not here to change things, he said. She looked at him over her shoulder. Her eyes were calm and very direct. Mr. Morgan, I am here to be your wife. On this ranch, in this climate, that means I'll be managing a household, contributing to the work of this property, and making decisions daily that affect both our survival. I cannot do that without information. She turned back to unpacking. I'm not asking permission to be useful. I'm telling you what useful looks like. Caleb stood very still. In 36 years on this earth, no one had spoken to him quite like that. He walked out the back door and stood in the barn for 10 minutes, doing nothing at all except breathing through his nose and waiting for the strange pressure in his chest to decide what it was. Dinner that night was the first quiet confrontation of something neither of them had named yet. She cooked without asking where anything was. She'd already found it all. When Caleb came back inside, the kitchen smelled like something his mother used to make. Savory broth, salt meat, dried herbs. 2 plates on the table, 2 cups of water, the stove drawing clean for the first time in months. He sat down. She sat across from him. They ate in silence for a while. Then he said, You didn't have to cook. First night. I know, she said. I wanted to. You walked 4 miles in that heat. I've walked longer in worse. He looked at her. Where? She met his eyes steadily. Chicago isn't soft, whatever you may think of city people. I walked 2 miles to work every morning for 4 years. 2 miles back every season God invented. She took a sip of water. The heat here is different. Drier. I'll adjust. He studied her a moment. Why did you come? He asked. She considered the question the way she seemed to consider most things, seriously, without rushing. Because in Chicago, I had 2 choices, she said. I could keep teaching other people's children in a school that paid me 30 cents a day and called it sufficient. Or I could come west where the work is harder and the life is mine to build. She set her fork down. I didn't come because I needed saving, Mr. Morgan. I came because I chose to. He had no answer for that. She picked her fork back up. And you, she said. Why did you send for a wife? He was quiet long enough that she looked up at him. My father built this ranch, he said finally. His father broke the first ground. I am not going to be the one who lets it die because I couldn't manage it alone. He paused. I needed help. That's honest, she said. I try to be. She nodded slow and considered. All right then, we understand each other. They finished the meal without speaking. But it was a different kind of silence than the one before it. Less like a wall, more like two people who had said enough for one day and knew it. 3 days and Caleb came back from the east pasture at noon and stopped dead in the middle of the yard. His woodpile had been restacked. He stood and looked at it for a full 30 seconds without moving. He had stacked that wood himself, the same way every year, the same way his father had taught him. Length by length ends out. It wasn't elegant, but it stood, and it had stood for 6 years without complaint. What was in front of him now was different. Every same piece of wood, but arranged in a tight interlocking pattern, the grain turned to shed water, heaviest logs at the base, lightest at the crown. 3 feet narrower, 2 feet taller. And he could see it immediately with the eye of a man who'd worked land his whole life, significantly easier to pull from without the whole structure shifting. It was more efficient than his system, by a considerable margin. Pete drifted up beside him. She did it this morning, Pete said, before breakfast. Said she saw a better way. Caleb said nothing. She asked if you'd mind, Pete added. I told her I reckoned you probably would. A pause. She said, thank you for the information, and went ahead anyway. Caleb put his hat back on. He walked to the barn. He did not say a single word about the woodpile. Not that day, not the next, not the one after that. But something had moved inside him, quiet, small, and impossible to name, like a fence post driven deeper into ground than he had expected it to go. Dead. On the 5th morning, he came downstairs before dawn and found her already at the kitchen table. A book open in front of her. A cup of tea steaming at her elbow. She was writing something in the margins in her small, precise hand. She didn't look up. There's coffee, she said. He poured a cup and sat across from her. What are you reading? She turned the cover toward him. An agricultural journal. Irrigation systems, she said. The creek level is lower than it should be for July. The west pasture is drying faster than the east. If it isn't addressed before August, you'll lose grass coverage on the slope, and the cattle will drift toward the creek bed and— I know my land, he said. I know you do, she said without any edge to it. I'm telling you what I've seen in 5 days. You can tell me if I've missed something. He sat with that. Creek runs low every summer, he said. Always has. Not this low, she said. I asked Pete. He agreed. She slid the journal across the table toward him. On the open page over the printed text, she had drawn a diagram in her small, careful handwriting. He leaned forward and looked. It was his east pasture, drawn from memory, accurate to the tree line and the slope gradient. And overlaid across it, a proposed channel diversion, precise, practical, drawn in a hand that understood what it was drawing. He stared at it for a long moment. You drew this, he said. Yes. From memory. I walked the pasture twice. She said it the way you said the sky was blue, a simple fact about the world. The diversion wouldn't require more than 3 days of labor with the right tools. It would redirect water to the west slope before the August heat peaks. You'd hold the grass coverage. The herd wouldn't drift. She wrapped both hands around her teacup. It's your decision, of course. Caleb looked at the diagram. Then he looked at her. She was already reading again, pen-scratching small notes in the margin. 11 years. He had run this ranch alone for 11 years, every decision, every season, every drought and flood and bad winter and worse spring. He had never once sat at his own kitchen table and had someone hand him a solution to a problem he hadn't yet said out loud. He did not know what to do with that, so he did what he always did. He stood, picked up his hat, and said, I'll think on it. Of course, Evelyn said without looking up. He walked out into the summer heat. Into his land, the land his father had broken, the land he had always known better than he knew anything else. And for the first time in 11 years, Caleb Morgan walked out onto it with the quiet, unsettling suspicion that someone else might know something about it that he didn't. Underneath the unsettling buried so far down, he wouldn't look at it yet. Something else stirred, something that felt just faintly like relief. The irrigation diagram stayed on the kitchen table for 2 more days. Caleb didn't touch it, didn't move it, didn't acknowledge it out loud to anyone. But he looked at it every morning when he poured his coffee, and every morning he looked a little longer than the morning before. Evelyn didn't ask him about it again. She didn't push. She didn't circle back with reminders or arguments. She simply went about her days with the same unhurried efficiency she brought to everything: the kitchen, the root cellar, the fencing, the feed storage, and left the diagram exactly where it was, as if she understood that some men needed to arrive at a decision on their own terms, or they wouldn't arrive at all. That understanding, Caleb realized somewhere around the 3rd morning, was more sophisticated than anything he'd expected from her. It irritated him considerably. Pete noticed. Pete noticed everything, which was one of the reasons Caleb had kept him on for 11 years, and one of the reasons he occasionally wanted to fire him. "She asked you about the irrigation again," Pete said, not looking up from the harness he was mending. "No," Caleb said. What does that mean?" "Nothing. Just Caleb set down the post driver. "Say what you're thinking, Pete." Pete looked up, then carefully, the way a man looked up when he was about to say something he'd already decided to say, but wanted one more second to confirm he actually meant it. "I'm thinking she's smart enough not to need to ask again," he said. "And I'm thinking that bothers you more than if she'd argued." Caleb picked the post driver back up. "That's enough," he said. "Yes, sir," Pete said, and went back to the harness. But he was right, and they both knew it, and that was the particular kind of conversation Caleb hated most, the kind that ended before it was over. That afternoon, he walked the east pasture. All of it end to end, the way he hadn't done in a full season, because he knew his land by instinct, and instinct had always been enough. He walked the creek line. He crouched down and put his hand in the water and felt the pull of the current, how shallow it ran, how warm it already was for early July. He looked at the west slope and saw what she'd seen: the dry patches spreading from the outer edge inward, the grass going pale at the tips, the cattle avoiding that corner without being driven away from it. He stood there for a long time. Then he walked back to the house, picked up the diagram from the table without a word, and brought it out to the barn where Pete was finishing up. "Tell me what you'd need," he said, setting it on the workbench. Pete studied it for a moment. 3 days of labor, maybe 4 if the ground's harder than she estimated. He looked up. "Tom and Ricky could handle the digging if you work alongside them." "How'd she estimate the ground hardness?" Caleb asked. Pete almost smiled. "She asked me 3 days ago." Caleb looked at the diagram again, at the small, precise handwriting in the margins, at the calculations for water volume and slope grade that he could not have produced himself. "Start tomorrow," he said. "Don't tell her I approved it." Pete said nothing. "Pete." "I won't say a word," Pete said. "But Caleb, she's going to know." "I know she is," Caleb said. "Start tomorrow." He walked out before Pete could say anything else. That evening, Evelyn set dinner on the table and sat across from him and didn't say a word about irrigation channels or creek levels or west slopes. She talked about the root cellar. The ventilation was poor, and she wanted to cut a second vent before the August heat peaked, and asked if there was wood to spare for the frame. Caleb said there was. She said thank you. He said it was no trouble. They ate. It was the most ordinary conversation they'd had. It was also the first one that didn't feel like a negotiation. Caleb went to sleep that night and lay awake, staring at the ceiling, and tried to identify exactly what was different about this evening versus every other evening of the past 5 years, and the answer that came back to him was simple and faintly alarming. For the first time in a very long time, the house didn't feel empty. He didn't know what to do with that. So he went to sleep. The work on the irrigation channel started the next morning at first light. Caleb was already in the east pasture when Evelyn came out of the house. He heard the screen door. He didn't turn around. He heard her footsteps cross the yard stop, and then she was standing at the fence line, looking at the 3 men already digging in the direction her diagram had indicated. She was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Morgan," she said. Miss Hart, he said, still not turning. The channel angle on the north end should be 2 degrees steeper, she said. Otherwise the water will slow before it reaches the lower slope. I already told them, he said. Another silence. Then, all right. She went back inside. Caleb kept working. But somewhere in the middle of the morning, when the sweat was soaking through his shirt and the sun was pressing down like a judgment, he realized he was almost smiling, and he pressed his jaw together and drove his shovel into the earth harder than necessary. The channel took 3.5 days. On the morning of the 4th day, when they redirected the first flow, and the water moved exactly where the diagram said it would, spreading across the dry west slope in a slow, steady sheet. One of the younger hands, Tom, who was 19, and said whatever he was thinking without apparent filter, let out a whoop and said, "She got it exactly right. Every single inch of it." Caleb said, "Get back to work." Tom got back to work, grinning. That afternoon, Holt Granger rode in. Holt Granger owned the ranch that bordered Caleb's land to the north, 1,200 acres to Caleb's 800, a bigger operation, a bigger crew, and the permanent, slightly insufferable air of a man who had always had slightly more of everything than the men around him, and considered this a reflection of character rather than inheritance. He was 51, barrel-chested, with a handshake that came in too strong on purpose, and eyes that were always doing 2 things at once. He rode up to the fence where Caleb was working and didn't dismount. "Morgan," he said. "Granger," Caleb said. "Heard you sent for a wife." He looked around the yard with the particular interest of a man who'd already decided what he was looking for. "From Chicago." "That's right. City woman," Holt said. Something shifted in his tone, easy and careless, the kind of careless that was never actually careless. "Must be quite an adjustment having a woman like that out here. Different kind of creature than what you're used to." "She's doing fine," Caleb said. "I'm sure she thinks she is." Holt leaned on his saddle horn. "Some of the men in town been talking, saying you got a woman who does things her own way, reorganizing, giving opinions on ranch management." He let that sit a moment. "Doesn't sit right with some folks. Man's supposed to run his own operation, not have his wife doing it for him." The air between them went very still. Caleb set down his tool and straightened to his full height. "Is there something you needed, Granger, or did you ride 4 miles to tell me what folks are saying?" "Just being neighborly," Holt said. "Then I'll tell you neighborly. My ranch, my business. That's the end of it." Holt nodded slowly, the way men nodded when they hadn't been told what they wanted, but weren't ready to push further yet. "Water situation's getting serious," he said, shifting the subject with the ease of a man accustomed to navigating. "Creek's lower than I've seen in 8 years. Anybody with cattle's going to be hurting by August if it doesn't turn." He paused. "I've been thinking about water rights. Might be time some of the smaller operations thought about consolidation. Better management of the resource." Caleb looked at him evenly. "My water rights aren't for discussion." "Everything's for discussion when resources get scarce enough," Holt said pleasantly. He tipped his hat. "Just something to consider. Good day, Morgan." He turned his horse and rode back the way he'd come. Caleb stood watching him go until the dust settled. Then he turned and found Evelyn standing 10 feet behind him. He didn't know how long she'd been there. Long enough. He could tell by the set of her face, not angry, not rattled, but very still in that particular way she had when she was filing something away. "Who is he?" she asked. "Holt Granger, rancher to the north." "Does he come here often?" "No." "But he came today." "Yes." She was quiet a moment. "He wants your water rights." It wasn't a question. Caleb looked at her. "That's what I figure. And the talk in town about me, he came to use it," she said. Not wounded, not indignant, just clear-eyed and measuring. "To put you on the defensive about your own judgment before he made the ask." Caleb said nothing for a moment. "That's a sophisticated read on a 30-second conversation," he said finally. "Men like him aren't difficult to read," she said. "He's been doing that his whole life. The friendly pressure, the implication that you're not managing things properly, the offer that sounds like help." She looked toward the direction Holt had ridden. "He'll be back." "I know," Caleb said. "When he comes back," she said, "I'd like to be present." He looked at her sharply. "Not to speak," she said, reading his face perfectly. "Just to listen. I'll know more after the second conversation than the first." She met his eyes. "You don't have to explain to him that I have a voice, Mr. Morgan. You just have to not explain that I don't." There was a long weighted silence between them. "Fine," he said. She nodded once and walked back to the house. Caleb stood in the yard alone for a minute, and the thought that passed through him, unbidden, unwelcome, and impossible to entirely dismiss, was that in 36 years he had never once had anyone stand 10 feet behind him in a hard conversation and then hand him useful information afterward. He didn't know what to call that. He went back to work. That night the argument started over a pot of coffee. It was late after 10, the house dark except for the kitchen lamp. Caleb had come in from checking on a heifer that had been off her feed, and Evelyn was still at the table with her journal and her pen, which he'd come to understand was simply what she did in the evenings after the violin was put away. He poured himself a cup and sat down. And they were quiet for a few minutes, in the way they'd gotten used to being quiet together. Not uncomfortable, not particularly warm, just two people sharing the same space at the end of a long day. Then she said without looking up, "There's a problem with the feed storage." "What kind of problem?" he said. "The eastern bin has moisture coming in from the south wall. The grain on that side is starting to go sour. I noticed it this morning." She set down her pen. "If it spreads to the rest of the bin before you address it, you'll lose about 40% of your winter reserves. In a drought year, that's not a loss you can afford." Caleb set down his cup. "Why didn't you say something this morning?" "I did," she said. "I told Pete." The quiet that followed was a different kind of quiet. "You told Pete," he said. "He was the first one I saw." She said it simply without apology. "I thought he would tell you." "Pete works for me," Caleb said. "This is my ranch. When there's a problem, you come to me." She looked at him then, calm, direct. "You were in the east pasture. Pete was 6 feet away. The information needed to get to someone who could act on it, and it did. The bin still needs to be repaired regardless of who you heard it from first." "That's not the point." "Then what is the point, Mr. Morgan?" Her voice was even, not challenging, not backing down, just asking. "The point," he said, and he heard the edge in his own voice and couldn't quite pull it back, "is that you have been on this ranch for 11 days. 11. And in 11 days, you have restacked my wood, redirected my water, reorganized my kitchen, diagnosed my fence posts, and started consulting with my foreman about my feed storage, without asking me about any of it." She didn't flinch. "I asked you about the irrigation. You drew the diagram and left it on my table, because you needed to decide in your own time," she said, "which you did." "That's not—" He stopped, pressed his hand flat on the table, started again. "Evelyn, I don't need to be managed." Something moved across her face, then quick and small, but he caught it. Not hurt exactly, something closer to recognition. "I'm not managing you," she said quietly. "I'm managing the ranch, the same as you are. That's what I'm here for." "You're here because I sent for a wife." "Yes," she said. "And in this territory, in this season with a drought coming, and a neighbor who wants your water and winter reserves that are about to go sour, what that means is someone who keeps this operation alive alongside you." She held his gaze. "I'm not trying to take your ranch from you, Caleb. I'm trying to help you keep it." It was the first time she had used his given name. Neither of them acknowledged it. But it sat there in the kitchen between them like a lit match, small, bright, and changing the temperature of everything around it. Caleb leaned back in his chair. He was quiet for a long moment. "The feed bin," he said finally. "Yes," she said. "Show me in the morning." "All right." He stood, took his cup to the sink, and paused there with his back to her. "For what it's worth," he said without turning around. "You were right about the west slope. The water's holding." He heard the slight controlled exhale of her breath. "Thank you for telling me," she said. He went to bed. He lay awake for 40 minutes. The feed bin took 2 days to repair. Caleb did most of it himself, with Tom helping on the second afternoon, and Evelyn appeared once to show him exactly where the moisture was coming from, and then disappeared again without comment when he got to work. He appreciated that. He didn't say so, but he thought she probably knew. On the third day after the bin repair, a woman from town came to call. Her name was Margaret Colson, wife of the feed store owner, and she arrived on a Tuesday morning in a buggy she drove herself with the particular confidence of a woman who had been the informal social arbiter of Millhaven for 20 years and knew it. She was 62, round-faced, sharp-eyed, and brought a tin of cookies that were less a gift and more a social instrument. Caleb was at the barn when she arrived. He stayed at the barn. Evelyn answered the door. He could hear them from where he was working, not the words, just the cadence. Margaret's voice sociable and probing and slightly too warm. Evelyn's voice polite, measured, giving nothing away. He told himself he wasn't listening. He was listening. 20 minutes later, Margaret's buggy left. Caleb walked to the house. Evelyn was at the kitchen counter cutting dried beef with the small, precise movements she brought to everything. She didn't look up. "She came to evaluate me," she said. "I know," he said. "She asked how I was adjusting to ranch life. She asked how we were getting along. She asked whether I found the work overwhelming." Evelyn set down the knife. She also mentioned in a roundabout way that the men in town thought it was irregular a wife who gave her husband advice about his land management. "What did you say?" Caleb asked. "I said I couldn't speak for the men in town," Evelyn said, "and that I found ranch work very interesting." She picked up the knife again. "She left uncertain whether to like me or not." "That's fine. Uncertain is more useful than decided." Caleb leaned against the doorframe. He looked at her, this woman who had been in his house for 2 weeks and had already navigated Holt Granger, a community rumor, and Margaret Colson's social interrogation with the same unruffled competence she brought to irrigation diagrams and feed storage and wood piles. "You've done this before," he said slowly. "Handled people like this." She paused in her cutting. "What do you mean?" "You know how to read a room," he said. "How to give people what they need without giving them what they want. That's not something a person just has. That's something they've learned." She was quiet for a moment. Chicago was not a gentle place to be a woman with opinions. She said finally, "You learned quickly who you could trust and who you couldn't, and how to navigate the distance between them." He waited. There was something else there underneath the surface. He could feel it. She set the knife down again, and this time she didn't pick it back up. She turned and looked at him directly the way she always did, eyes steady, giving him the full weight of her attention. "There was a man," she said, "before I came here." Caleb didn't move. "His name was Charles Whitmore," she said. "He was respectable, educated. He wanted a wife who was educated enough to be interesting at dinner and quiet enough not to be inconvenient the rest of the time." She said it without bitterness, just the flat clarity of someone who had processed a thing thoroughly and come out the other side. "We were engaged for 8 months. I ended it 3 days before the wedding." The kitchen was very still. "Why?" Caleb asked. "Because I asked him whether I could continue teaching after we were married," she said. "He said no. I asked why. He said a wife of his didn't need employment. I said that I wasn't asking about need, I was asking about choice." She held Caleb's gaze. "He told me that when I was his wife, my choices would be his to make." The silence stretched out. "So I made the last choice I had," she said. "And I came west." Caleb stood in the doorway of his own kitchen and felt something shift in his understanding of her, not just who she was, but why she was the way she was. The questions on the platform, the handshake, the woodpile. Every single thing she had done since the moment she stepped off that train had been the action of a woman who had handed her future to a man once and been told it was no longer hers, and had decided with absolute finality that it would never happen again. "He let you go," Caleb said. "He didn't have a choice by that point," she said simply. "Neither did I." Caleb nodded slowly. He pushed off the doorframe. He walked to the table and sat down, not across from her, beside her at the corner of the table, close enough that they were in the same conversation instead of two separate ones. "I'm not him," he said. She looked at him. "I'm not saying that to make a promise I don't know if I can keep," he said. And there was something effortful about the honesty, something that cost him something. "I'm saying it because I think you should know that I understand why you came here the way you did. And I don't want to be that." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was lower, softer than usual, but still steady. "You gave me the irrigation channel," she said. "It was a good plan," he said. "You didn't have to admit that." "No," he said. "I didn't." She looked at him for a long, measuring moment. And then, for the first time since she had stepped off that train, something in her face released. Not a smile exactly, but the particular absence of guardedness, the way a person looked when they had been braced for something and it hadn't come, and the relief of it was too real to entirely hide. "All right, Caleb Morgan," she said quietly. "All right, Evelyn Hart," he said. She picked up the knife. He stayed at the table. And for a while, they just existed in the same room, without it costing either of them anything, which was new, and neither of them said so, but they both felt it. The drought tightened its grip on the valley in the third week of July. The creek dropped another 4 inches. The air turned a particular kind of dry that cracked the corners of your mouth and made the dust rise with every step. 3 of the neighboring ranches lost cattle dehydration and heat cows going down in the pasture before anyone noticed the signs. Word traveled fast in the valley. It always did. Caleb pushed the herd east closer to the creek, rotating the pasture sections to spare the grass. Evelyn started tracking water consumption against head count in a small notebook she kept in her apron pocket, and every evening she gave him the numbers, and every evening he adjusted the next day's plan. It was not a system they had agreed to. It was a system that had developed the way useful things developed because it worked, and they were both practical enough to keep doing it. On the 22nd day, Tom came in from the north fence at a run. Caleb was at the barn. He heard the boots hitting the packed dirt before he saw the kid, and he came out of the stall with his hand braced on the door before Tom even slowed down. "Holt Granger's men," Tom said, breathing hard. "They're diverting the creek." Everything went cold in Caleb's chest. "What?" he said. "Up north, maybe a mile past your boundary line. They're digging a channel, pulling water off the main creek and running it toward Granger's south pasture. I counted 4 men with shovels." A water diversion on the main creek upstream of Caleb's land in the middle of a drought would cut his water access by a third, maybe more. In August heat with 200 cattle to keep alive, that was not a problem. That was a death sentence for the herd. Caleb had his hat on and was moving before Tom finished the sentence. "Get Pete," he said. "Tell him to saddle up, now." He was at the house door in 30 seconds. Evelyn was inside. She heard his boots and came out of the kitchen, took one look at his face and said, "What happened?" "Granger's diverting the creek," he said. He didn't stop moving, going for his coat, his rifle from the rack. Tom spotted his men working a channel north of the boundary. She was very still for exactly 2 seconds. "Is this legal?" "It's complicated," he said. "How complicated?" "Depends on where exactly they're working. If they're on his land, technically, he has the right to use the water that crosses his property. If they've gone past the center line of the creek, they've crossed onto shared water rights, and there's a territorial law against it." He buckled his belt. "I need to go see where they are." "I know where the center line is," she said. He stopped. She was already moving toward the table, toward her journals. She pulled out the map she had drawn, the pasture, the creek, the boundaries, and pointed without hesitation to a mark she had already made in pencil along the creek's north edge. "I measured the full waterway run 3 days after I arrived. I marked the center line based on the original survey your father filed." She looked up at him. "It's documented." He stared at her. "It was in the papers in the desk drawer," she said quietly. "I read everything in that desk in my first week. I thought it was important to understand what this land was legally." You read my land papers, he said. I read everything, she said. I needed to know what we had. He stood there for a second, 2 seconds in the doorway of his own house, looking at a woman who had arrived 22 days ago with 2 suitcases and a violin, and had apparently spent her first week quietly learning the legal boundaries of his property. Then he held out his hand. She gave him the map. Come with me, he said. She was at the door before he finished the sentence. Pete was already mounted when they came out of the house. He took one look at Evelyn beside Caleb and said nothing at all, which was the smartest thing Pete had done in recent memory. They rode hard for the north fence. The summer heat pressed down on all of them, thick and airless, the kind of heat that made the distance look like it was moving. Caleb pushed the pace and didn't look back, and didn't need to, because he could hear her horse keeping up without any instruction to do so. They found Granger's men exactly where Tom had said they were. 4 of them working steadily, already 4 feet into a channel that angled clearly toward Granger's south fields. The creek water was already beginning to find the new path, a thin thread of it edging into the cut, testing the way forward. Holt Granger himself stood nearby watching. He turned when he heard them coming, and his expression arranged itself into the particular configuration of a man who had prepared for this conversation and was not surprised by it. Morgan, he said. Holt, Caleb said. He dismounted. He did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. You want to show me your survey marks? Holt's eyes moved just for a moment to Evelyn, who had dismounted and was standing slightly to Caleb's right, with the map open in her hands and her face perfectly composed. This is my land, Holt said. I have every right to use the water that crosses it. Show me your survey marks, Caleb said again. Quiet, flat, absolute. Holt looked at him. Then he looked at the map in Evelyn's hands. His jaw shifted slightly. That channel, Evelyn said, her voice was mild, almost conversational, is 11 feet past the center line of the waterway as recorded in the 1871 Territorial Survey. Which means you are redirecting water from a shared resource without legal authority. She looked at Granger directly. I can show you the documentation if you'd like to compare it to your own. There was a very long silence. Granger's 4 men had stopped digging. They were looking at Holt. Holt looked at Evelyn for 3 full seconds. Something moved behind his eyes, surprise, recalculation, the swift and private adjustment of a man who had walked into a situation expecting 1 opponent and found 2. Your wife is very confident in her figures, he said to Caleb. Her figures are correct, Caleb said. The law in this territory is exactly what she said it is, Caleb said. I'll ride to the county office this week and file a formal protest if I need to, or your men can fill that channel back in, and we can handle this the way neighbors are supposed to handle it. He held Granger's gaze. Your call. Another long silence. Holt looked at his men. He looked at the channel. He looked at Evelyn's map. And then the easy, practiced pleasantness came back to his face, a mask being slid back into place. Misunderstanding, he said smoothly. We'll re-examine the survey. Boys, take a break. His men set down their shovels. Caleb nodded once. He turned his horse and started back. Pete fell in beside him. Evelyn mounted and rode on Caleb's other side. They covered 50 yards before any of them spoke. Then Pete said quietly, almost to himself, Lord have mercy. Caleb didn't respond. But he glanced sideways at Evelyn, who was riding straight-backed and looking forward and holding the map with the careful composure of someone who had not yet decided what to do with the energy of the last 10 minutes. How long did you know about the survey center line? He asked. Since the 5th day, she said. You never mentioned it. You hadn't needed it yet. He looked at her profile, the set of her jaw, the steadiness of her hands on the reins, the particular quality of her stillness that he'd come to understand wasn't absence, but presence. The full, deliberate presence of someone who was always paying attention. Evelyn, he said. She turned to look at him. Thank you, he said. She held his gaze for a moment. The afternoon heat pressed down on both of them. The dust rising from the horses' hooves, the dry valley stretching out in every direction under the white Montana sky. You would have handled it, she said. Not as cleanly, he said. She turned back to the road, but her chin lifted slightly, a small quiet thing, and Caleb saw it, and he looked away before she could see that he had. That evening, he sat on the porch after dark and listened to her play the violin through the open window. He had never particularly thought about music before. It was not a thing that had mattered to him. But sitting there in the dry summer night with the heat finally letting up just slightly and the stars coming out hard and bright over the Montana hills, the sound of the violin moved through the dark in a way that he hadn't expected. Not soft, not delicate, searching, complex. Like a question being asked in a language he didn't speak but could almost understand. Pete came and stood nearby after a while. They listened together without saying anything. Then Pete said, "She's something else, isn't she?" "Yeah," Caleb said. "You ordered a wife," Pete said. Caleb looked at him. Pete looked back with 11 years of knowing him in his face. "I'm just saying," Pete said, "that ain't what showed up." Caleb said nothing, but he stayed on that porch for a long time after Pete left, listening to the music move through the dark, and he did not go inside until it stopped, and then he sat for a while longer in the silence it left behind, because the silence after it was different from the silence before it. And he didn't entirely want to let go of that yet. Caleb rode into Millhaven the following Monday to file the formal water rights protest at the county land office, and he had not been inside the building 4 minutes before the clerk behind the desk, a thin man named Aldous, who wore the expression of someone perpetually bracing for bad news, looked up from his ledger with the particular discomfort of a person who knows something the person in front of them doesn't. "Mr. Morgan," Aldous said. "I'm here to file a protest on a water diversion," Caleb said. He set Evelyn's map on the counter. "Holt Granger, north boundary of the shared creek. I've got the center line documented against the 1871 territorial survey." Aldous looked at the map. Then he looked at Caleb with that expression that was really more a kind of managed flinching. "Mr. Morgan," he said carefully. "Mr. Granger was here on Friday." Caleb went still. "Friday was 3 days ago." "Yes, sir." "Before I stopped his men from digging." "Yes, sir." Aldous opened a different ledger, turned it, and pushed it across the counter. He filed a formal petition, asserting that the Morgan operation's water usage constitutes, I'm reading his language now, inefficient and wasteful management of a shared territorial resource, and requesting a county review of existing water right allocations along the North Creek corridor. Caleb read it. He read it once fast, and then again slowly. "He filed this before I came to him," he said. "Yes, sir?" "He was planning this before he even rode to my property." Aldous said nothing. He was a bureaucrat, not a man who offered opinions on the behavior of people who filed things in his office. But the look on his face said enough. Caleb picked up the map. "File my protest," he said. "Every piece of documentation I have. I'll bring the originals tomorrow." "Of course," Aldous said. "There's one other thing." He hesitated. "The petition includes supporting statements from neighboring landowners." He turned another page. 3 of them. Caleb looked at the names. He recognized all 3. He had done business with all 3. One of them, Dale Whitson, had borrowed Caleb's equipment 2 winters ago when his own broke down, and Caleb had sent it over without charge and never mentioned it again. He stood at that counter for a moment, with something hard moving through his chest. Not quite anger. Something colder and more final, the feeling of a man who has just learned exactly which direction his enemies are coming from and exactly how many of them there are. "Thank you, Aldous," he said. He walked out. He sat on his horse in the summer heat for a full minute before he started back toward the ranch. By the time he arrived, his jaw had been set so long it ached. Evelyn was in the yard when he rode in. She read his face the same way she read everything fast and accurate. She didn't ask how it went. She waited. He dismounted, handed the reins to Tom, and said, "Come inside." He told her all of it at the kitchen table, the ledger details, the names, the timing. She listened without interrupting, which was one of the things he'd come to depend on without meaning to, the way she gave a problem her full silence before she spoke. When he finished, she said, "He filed before he came to your property." "Yes." "Which means the visit was theater," she said. "The friendly warning about consolidation. He already had the legal mechanism in motion. He came to watch how you'd react, to see what he was dealing with." "That's how I read it," Caleb said. "And the neighbors who signed. I'll deal with that later." She looked at him. "Whitson," she said quietly. He met her eyes. "You helped him," she said. It wasn't an accusation, just a recognition of what the betrayal cost. "I thought he was a decent man," Caleb said. "He may still be," she said. "Decent men make self-interested choices when someone like Granger puts enough pressure on them. That doesn't make it right, but it means he's not your enemy. He's just afraid." Caleb was quiet. "The ones to focus on," she said, "are Granger and whoever is advising him. That petition isn't frontier thinking. That's legal strategy. Someone with more education than your average rancher drafted that language." He looked at her. "You think he has a lawyer. I think he has someone," she said. "The phrasing is too precise. Inefficient and wasteful management of a shared territorial resource. That's not something Holt Granger wrote at his kitchen table." She folded her hands on the surface. "We need to respond in kind. And we need to do it before the county schedules a review, because once it's in formal proceedings everything becomes harder." "You know territorial water law," he said. "I know how to read law," she said. "I've been reading your father's land filings for 3 weeks. The right is clearly established. But we need to present it correctly, or it won't matter how right we are." He looked at her across the table. The afternoon heat sat on the house like a hand pressing down. Outside, somewhere in the distance, a cow was lowing that particular low sound that meant discomfort, not alarm, not yet. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. She picked up her pen. They worked until dark. The community meeting happened 4 days later. Millhaven had these gatherings occasionally, not formal, not official, just the natural aggregation of frontier people who shared water and land and weather, and understood that what affected one spread to the rest. Word had gotten out that Granger had filed against Morgan, and in a drought year, water rights disputes were not abstract concerns. They were survival. Caleb and Evelyn arrived together. That itself was a kind of statement, though neither of them framed it that way. The hall was full 30, maybe 35 people. Caleb recognized nearly every face. He nodded to the ones who nodded to him. He did not look at Whitson, who stood near the back wall with his hat in both hands, and the posture of a man who had made a decision he was no longer comfortable with. Holt Granger was at the front, easy and expansive, working the room with the practiced warmth of a man who understood that likability was a form of currency and had spent his whole life accumulating it. He saw Caleb come in. His eyes moved to Evelyn. He smiled. "Morgan," he said. "Glad you could make it." "Wouldn't miss it," Caleb said. The meeting started with the drought pasture conditions. Cattle losses projected water levels through August. 2 ranchers had already lost animals. A third was considering selling part of his herd early rather than watch them die on dry grass. The mood in the room was the particular combination of fear and stubbornness that frontier people wore when the land turned against them. They would not panic, but they were close enough to it that you could feel it underneath the controlled voices. Then Granger spoke. He did it smoothly, the way he did everything. Couched in concern for the community, wrapped in the language of collective problem-solving. The creek was a shared resource. In a time of shortage, shared resources needed managed distribution. It wasn't right that one operation should draw more than its sustainable share, while neighbors went wanting. There ought to be a county-mediated allocation system. He'd taken the first step by filing with the county office. He hoped others would support the review process. He didn't name Caleb directly. He didn't have to. The room was very quiet when he finished. Caleb stood up. He had planned what he was going to say. He knew the legal points. He knew the survey documentation. He was prepared to be precise and controlled and let the facts carry themselves. He had not planned for what happened next. Evelyn stood up beside him. The room shifted, that subtle collective readjustment of attention that happened when something unexpected walked into the center of a situation. She looked at Granger, and then she looked at the room. "My name is Evelyn Morgan," she said, and it was the first time she had used the name, the first time either of them had heard it said that way. "And I've spent the last 3 weeks studying the water system on our land and on this valley. I'd like to share what I found, if the room will permit it." Nobody told her she couldn't. The silence itself was permission. She spoke for 7 minutes. She had numbers: water volume, creek level measurements, draw rates, herd size ratios. She had context, how the Morgan water usage compared historically to the valley average, how the irrigation channel they'd constructed had actually improved downstream flow by reducing waste absorption in the dry west slope. She did not attack Granger. She did not address the petition directly. She simply presented information with the particular clarity of someone who had learned that the most powerful thing a person could do in a room full of frightened people was give them something real to hold on to. When she finished, there was a silence that lasted long enough to be significant. Then an older rancher named Birch, who had been running cattle in the valley for 30 years and was generally considered the closest thing Millhaven had to institutional memory, said, "That channel of yours, the one you dug last week, you said it improved downstream flow." "By roughly 15%, Evelyn said. "I can show you the measurements." Birch looked at Granger. He didn't say anything. He just looked. And then he looked back at Evelyn with something in his face that was not quite approval, but was the precursor to it. "I'd be interested in seeing those measurements," Birch said. 3 other voices said they would too. Granger was still smiling, but the smile had tightened at the edges in a way that only a person paying close attention would notice. Caleb was paying very close attention. After the meeting, when people were filing out and the low hum of separate conversations filled the hall, a woman touched Evelyn's arm near the door. She was about 60, gray-haired, with the kind of face that had weathered more than it showed. Her name was Ruth Birch, the old rancher's wife, and she pulled Evelyn slightly aside and said quietly enough that Caleb was almost out of earshot, "You said Morgan. You took his name already." Evelyn said yes. Ruth Birch looked at her for a moment. "You did well tonight," she said. "Don't let them convince you otherwise." She walked away before Evelyn could answer. Outside, riding home in the dark, Caleb said, "You used my name." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "Does that bother you?" "No," he said. And then after a pause, "You didn't tell me you were going to speak." "I didn't know I was going to," she said. "Until you stood up and I thought 2 voices carry further than one." He considered that. "You were right," he said. "I know," she said. And there was something almost wry in it, something close to the edge of humor, and Caleb heard it and felt something in his chest. Do a thing he hadn't experienced in years, which was lift slightly, without clear cause. They rode the rest of the way home in silence, but it was the kind of silence that had warmth in it. The drought broke no promises in the days that followed. By the end of the 3rd week of July, the creek had dropped to its lowest level in a decade. Pete's daily water count was grim and getting grimmer. The herd was holding the channel, and Evelyn's adjusted feeding schedule had kept them from the worst. But holding was different from thriving, and Caleb could see the difference every morning when he walked the pasture. The cattle were quieter than they should be, moving less, conserving energy the way animals did when the land stopped being reliable. Evelyn started working later into the evenings. Caleb noticed the light under her door when he went to bed. He noticed the dark circles developing under her eyes, which she gave no acknowledgement to. She was pulling from an agricultural resource she'd sent for a pamphlet series from a university extension program in the East on drought management for grazing herds and cross-referencing it against the specific conditions of the Morgan land, with the same systematic intensity she brought to everything. One evening later than usual, he knocked on the open doorway of the kitchen where she was working. She looked up. "You need to sleep," he said. "I will," she said. "In a while." "Evelyn?" She set down her pen. The feeding ratios need to be adjusted again. If I don't recalculate before tomorrow morning, we lose another half day of efficiency. Half a day won't. In a drought year, half a day is 3 days, she said. Not sharp, just factual. I know you know that. He came into the kitchen and sat down across from her. He looked at the papers spread across the table. Her notes, his father's land filings, the pamphlet pages with her annotations crowding every margin. "Show me what you're doing," he said. She looked at him. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "Show me." She showed him. She walked him through the calculation head count against available forage water volume, against heat stress, thresholds, the adjustment to the supplemental feed she wanted to introduce to compensate for the reduced grass. He asked questions. She answered them. He pushed back on 2 of the numbers, and she thought about it and adjusted one of them, and held the other, and explained why, and he listened and accepted it. It was the most they had worked together, not in proximity, but actually together, their thinking, moving in the same direction at the same time. It was past midnight when they finished. "That's solid," he said, looking at the final numbers. "Yes," she said. "You've been doing this every night." "Most nights." He leaned back. "Why didn't you ask me to help?" She looked at the table for a moment, then at him. "I wasn't sure you'd want to," she said. "I wasn't sure the offer would be welcome." It landed differently than he expected. He'd assumed confidence from her in all things. He'd assumed she knew her own value in every room she walked into. But this, the quiet uncertainty about whether he wanted her company, whether he valued the collaboration beyond its practical outputs, this was something different. This was a woman who had learned not to assume welcome, because welcome had been withdrawn from her before. "It's welcome," he said. She nodded once. She began organizing the papers. "Evelyn," he said. She stopped. "What happened with Whitmore?" he said. Did he come after you left?" The question sat between them. She straightened the papers carefully. "He was angry," she said. "The social embarrassment was significant. We were 3 days from the wedding. His family had traveled." She paused. "He sent 2 letters after I left Chicago. I didn't respond to either." "What did they say?" She was quiet a moment. "The first one said I had humiliated him. The second one said that a woman who made a commitment and broke it was a woman without character, and that he would make sure the right people knew it." She said it with the same flat, processed clarity she'd used before someone who had turned a wound over so many times it had gone smooth. "I came west partly because I knew his reach was shorter out here." Caleb said, "Has anyone contacted you since you arrived?" She met his eyes. Something flickered there. "No," she said. "Not yet." He heard the yet. He sat with it. "If someone does," he said, "I want to know." "All right," she said. He stood. He picked up 1/2 of the organized papers. "I'll put these in the desk," he said. "Go to sleep, Evelyn." She almost smiled. "Good night, Caleb." He walked down the hall. He put the papers in the desk. He stood there for a moment with his hand on the desk drawer and thought about Charles Whitmore, a man he'd never met in a city he'd never been to, who had looked at this woman and seen something to own rather than someone to build with, and felt something move through him that was not quite anger and not quite protectiveness, but was related to both. He went to bed. 3 days later, Pete found him at the north fence with his voice carrying a particular register that Caleb had learned over 11 years meant something was wrong in a way that wasn't immediately explainable. "You need to come," Pete said. "What happened?" "Nothing happened, but you need to come." They rode to the south edge of the property near the road that connected the Morgan Ranch to Millhaven. And there, Pete pointed to the fence post at the road's edge. Nailed to it was a notice, printed, not handwritten. Printed on official-looking paper with county heading language at the top. Caleb read it. His jaw tightened with each line. It was a notice of formal county water review, scheduled for August 15th, with the Morgan Ranch listed as the subject of the inquiry. And at the bottom, under the section that listed interested parties who had formally registered concern, there were now 5 names instead of 3. 2 more, Pete said. I see them, Caleb said. Birch isn't on it, Pete said, and there was something careful in how he said it. No, Caleb said. He's not. The review is public, Pete said. Anyone can attend. Granger's going to pack that room. Caleb pulled the notice off the post. He folded it once and put it in his pocket. Get me Tom and Ricky, he said. I want the east fence line checked end to end today. Granger's men have been pushing boundaries, and I want documentation of every post and every survey mark. Yes, sir, Pete said. He started to turn his horse, then stopped. Caleb, whose idea was it to put that notice on your fence post instead of delivering it to the house? Caleb looked at him. Just asking, Pete said, because that notice should have come through Aldous. Official delivery, not nailed to a post on a public road where anybody passing could read it. He paused. Someone wanted it seen. Caleb rode back to the house. He found Evelyn in the barn of all places, crouched down examining the front right hoof of the heifer that had been off her feed with the particular careful focus she brought to things she'd decided to understand. The heifer was standing still, which told Caleb she'd been there a while because the heifer trusted nobody quickly. She's got a stone bruise, Evelyn said without looking up. Not infected. But she needs to be off the rocky ground for a week. Pete has been meaning to look at her, Caleb said. I noticed her limping this morning. She stood, wiped her hands on a cloth. She looked at his face. What is it? He gave her the notice. She read it. All the way through slowly, without expression. Then she read the bottom section again. Then she folded it in half the way he had and handed it back. August 15th. She said. 3 weeks. We need legal representation, she said. The nearest lawyer is in Helena, he said. 2 days' ride. Then we write a letter today, she said. She was already moving toward the house. We send Tom with it tomorrow morning. We request representation, and we send full documentation, the survey, the water measurements, the channel records, everything. She stopped at the barn door and turned. And we need to talk to Birch. He didn't sign, Caleb said. He didn't sign, she said, which means he's either neutral or he's sympathetic. Either way, he's the most influential man in this valley who isn't working against us. We need to know which way he's leaning before August 15th. She paused. Will you ride to him? Tomorrow, he said. Good. She turned to go. Evelyn. She stopped. The notice was nailed to the public road post, he said, not delivered to the house. She understood immediately. He could see it. Someone wanted the community to see it before you did, she said, to set the narrative before you could respond. That's what I think. She stood very still for a moment. Caleb Granger has someone advising him, someone who knows legal process and community pressure strategy. This is more than a neighbor wanting water rights. This is a campaign. I know, he said. Do you know who the advisor might be? He'd been turning that question over for 3 days. Someone with access to county filing procedures. Someone who knows how to time these things. He looked at her. Someone who isn't from here. The air between them went very careful. That's a lot of someone, she said. And then she went inside. The letter went to Helena with Tom the next morning before the sun was fully up. Caleb rode to the Birch Ranch at noon. Evelyn didn't ask to come this time. She stayed and continued the feeding adjustment, and when Caleb came back 4 hours later, she was on the porch with a cup of tea and watched him dismount with the patient reading attention she always gave him when something had happened that she needed to understand. He's sympathetic, Caleb said, sitting on the porch step. He doesn't like how Granger has handled this. Says it's not neighborly, and it sets a bad precedent. He paused. He also said, and I'm telling you exactly what he said that your presentation at the meeting changed the room. She was quiet. He said you gave people something factual when they were running on fear, Caleb said. He said that mattered. She looked down at her cup. Something moved across her face, not quite emotion, but the edge of it. Will he support us at the review? Caleb asked. He said he would attend, Caleb said. That's not the same thing. But it's something. She nodded slowly. It's enough for now. They sat together on the porch for a while, not talking, not needing to, with the summer heat pressing down on the valley and the creek somewhere in the distance running lower than it should. And Caleb looked out at his land, the way he had looked at it every day for 36 years. But it felt different now, in a way he couldn't precisely name, because there was someone beside him doing it too. The letter arrived on a Wednesday. Not from Helena. From Chicago. Tom brought it up from Millhaven with the regular mail. A slim envelope with formal handwriting that was too controlled, too deliberate, the handwriting of someone who wanted to project authority through the pen. The return address was a law office on Michigan Avenue. Caleb saw Evelyn's face when she took it from Tom's hand. She went still the way she went still when something required all of her concentration just to hold. Her expression didn't change, but her hands for the first time since he'd known her were not completely steady. "Go ahead," she said to Tom, and Tom went. She stood in the yard with the letter, and Caleb stood nearby and waited. She opened it. She read it. He watched her read it, and watched the stillness in her face become something harder and more protected the way stone was harder than skin. When she finished, she held the letter for a moment. Then she held it out to him. He looked at her. She nodded once. He took it and read. The letter was from a firm representing Charles Whitmore of Chicago, Illinois. It stated that Miss Evelyn Hart, and there the name was deliberate, the married name ignored entirely, had breached a formal engagement contract under Illinois civil law, and had relocated without restitution of associated financial damages, including deposits on venue and travel expenses of family members. It further stated that Mr. Whitmore was prepared to pursue civil remedy, and that as Miss Hart was now residing in a territory under United States federal jurisdiction, such remedy was not beyond reach. It requested a response within 30 days, confirming Miss Hart's willingness to discuss terms. And at the bottom, in a line that felt less like legal language and more like a message, Mr. Whitmore wished to make clear that he bore no ill will toward Miss Hart, and remained willing to resolve the matter privately and directly should she choose to be in contact. Caleb read it twice. Then he lowered the letter and looked at Evelyn. She was looking at him with the particular expression of a woman waiting for a verdict, not afraid of it but ready for whatever it was. As if she expected that this letter might change something, might change him. "He knows where you are," Caleb said. "Yes," she said. "Someone told him." Yes. The thing that had been sitting at the edge of his understanding for several days resolved itself now with the clean, cold clarity of a puzzle piece, finding its only possible position. "Whitmore and Granger," he said. She held his gaze. "Granger would need someone with legal expertise and no local reputation to lose," she said. "Whitmore would need information about where I'd gone and enough leverage to bring me back or punish me for leaving." She paused. "They're using each other." "He's using you to get to me," Caleb said. "And Granger's using him to get legal cover for the water claim." "Yes," she said. Her voice was very level. "I'm sorry," she said. I didn't know he would find me this quickly. I didn't know he would reach this far." "Stop," Caleb said. She looked at him. "Don't apologize for what he's doing," Caleb said. "You didn't do this. He did." The steadiness in her held. But something behind her eyes shifted just slightly, just enough that he could see it the way the smallest change in the creek told you everything about what was happening upstream. "What do you want to do?" he asked. She thought for a moment. When she answered, her voice was quiet, but absolute. "I want to respond to that letter through a lawyer of our own choosing," she said. "I want it documented that I am a married woman in a recognized territory, that my legal standing is as Mrs. Morgan, and that any civil claim under Illinois jurisdiction has no authority here." She looked at him. "And I want Granger to know that his advisor's connection to my personal history is now known, and that we consider it relevant to the water rights proceeding." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. "You want to put him on the defensive," he said. "I want him to know that we are not afraid, and we are not scrambling," she said. "Because the moment someone like Granger believes you're scrambling, he applies more pressure. The only thing that makes him pause is equal footing." Caleb folded the letter. He held it. "You don't have to stay," he said. She blinked. If this becomes too much, if what he's threatening creates problems you didn't bargain for." He said it carefully, each word placed with the precision of a man who was not good at this kind of thing and knew it. "I'm not going to hold you here against your will. You came of your own choice. You can make another one." The silence was very long. "Caleb Morgan," Evelyn said. "Yeah," he said. "I did not walk 4 miles through Montana summer heat," she said. "Reorganize your kitchen, redirect your water, stand up in a room full of strangers, rid your father's land filings, and calculate cattle feeding ratios in the middle of the night." Her voice did not waver, but something in it deepened. To leave because a frightened man in Chicago sent a letter. He looked at her. "This is my ranch too," she said. "You told me that. The day you said all right." She held his gaze with everything she had, which was considerable. "I'm not going anywhere." The heat pressed down on them both. The land spread out in every direction around them, dry and vast and demanding. And Caleb Morgan stood in the yard of his father's ranch with a letter in his hand, and a woman in front of him who had just claimed his land and his life as hers to fight for. And he felt something move through him that was not relief, not gratitude, not the quiet satisfaction of a practical arrangement working as planned. It was something he did not yet have words for, but it was there. "All right," he said. "Then let's write the response." She was already walking toward the house. He followed. The lawyer's letter from Helena arrived on a Thursday, 8 days after Tom had ridden out with their request, and Caleb was splitting wood in the side yard when Pete brought it up from the road. He read it standing right there, sweat already soaking through his shirt at 8 in the morning, the summer heat having stopped pretending it would be reasonable and committed fully to something meaner and more absolute. The letter had 2 things in it. The first was good. The Helena firm agreed to represent the Morgan interest at the August 15th County Review, and their initial assessment was that the water rights case was defensible. The documentation, Evelyn had compiled the survey markers. The water measurements, the channel records, was in the lawyer's words unusually thorough for a frontier operation, and he believed it would hold. The second thing was less good regarding the matter of Charles Whitmore's civil claim. The firm's position was that while the claim had no immediate legal authority in the territory, a prolonged dispute could create complications with Evelyn's formal legal standing, particularly if Whitmore escalated to federal channels. They recommended proactive resolution. Caleb folded the letter. He did not tell Evelyn the second part until that evening. He told her the first part over breakfast, and she nodded and said that was a good outcome and went back to her feeding calculations. He spent the day on the fence line with Tom and Ricky, doing the methodical physical work that had always been his best thinking space, turning the Whitmore problem over from every angle. By evening, he had decided there was no angle that made it better, so he told her all of it. She read the relevant section twice. "Proactive resolution," she said. "That's what he wrote." "He means paying him," she said. Flat clean, the way she processed things she didn't like. "That's how I read it." She was quiet for a moment. "I won't." "I know," he said. "It's not about the money," she said. "If I pay him, I'm confirming that what I did was wrong, that I owed him something I took away." She set the letter down. "I didn't take anything from him. I removed myself from a situation he'd constructed without my honest consent. That's not a debt." The lawyer might argue. "I don't care what the lawyer argues," she said. "I care what's true." Caleb looked at her across the table. Her jaw was set in the way it got when she'd already made a decision and was just waiting for the conversation to confirm it. He recognized that expression by now. He'd seen it on the train platform, in the barn, at the community meeting in the yard, when she'd held his gaze and told him she wasn't going anywhere. "Then we don't pay," he said. She looked up. "We write back, and we tell them to make their case," he said. "If Whitmore wants to push this to federal channels, let him try. The firm in Helena will handle it." He held her gaze. "But we don't pay him to feel better about you leaving." Something moved through her face, quick and real, the kind of thing she usually managed before it showed. She looked back down at the papers. "All right," she said quietly. "All right," he said. They wrote the response that night. It was the second letter they had drafted together at the kitchen table, and this one moved faster than the first, less deliberation, less measuring of words, more of the particular fluency that came from two people who had learned how each other thought. 2 days later, Dale Whitson rode up to the Morgan fence. Pete saw him first and came to find Caleb with that careful register in his voice again, the one that meant something needed handling. Caleb walked to the fence alone. He told Pete to stay back. Whitson sat his horse on the other side of the fence with his hat in his hands and the posture of a man who had been rehearsing something and was no longer certain any version of it was adequate. He was 58, lean, with the kind of face that work had weathered into something honest, even when the man himself had not been. "Morgan," he said. "Whitson," Caleb said. "I came to—" He stopped, started again. "I want to tell you I'm sorry for signing that petition." Caleb said nothing. He waited. "Granger came to me in June," Whitson said, "before the drought got bad. He told me he was organizing a community water management proposal. Said it would protect all the smaller operations from going under in a dry year. Said he needed names from established ranchers to give it credibility." He looked down at his hat. "He didn't tell me it was against you specifically until after I'd put my name to it." "Did you read what you signed?" Caleb asked. Whitson's jaw tightened. "Not closely enough," he said. "That's on me. I know it is." He looked up. "After your wife spoke at the meeting, after I understood what this was really about, I told Granger I wanted my name removed." "What did he say?" "He said it was filed and there was nothing to be done about it." Whitson's voice tightened. "Then he told me that if I made trouble about it, he'd revisit the water allocation question for my south pasture, which shares the same creek." So there it was. Granger had coerced the signatures the same way he pressured everything, with the quiet, deniable threat that the alternative was worse. "Why are you telling me this?" Caleb said. "Because I owe you." Whitson's voice was rough with something that cost him. "You sent that equipment over 2 winters back without asking anything for it. And I put my name to something that was aimed at you without even having the decency to read it properly." He held Caleb's gaze. "I can't pull the signature, but I can tell you what I know. And I can show up on August 15th and say it to the review board if you need me to." Caleb stood at his fence for a long moment. "I'll let you know," he said finally. Whitson nodded. He put his hat back on. He rode back the way he came without another word, and Caleb watched him go and thought about the way fear worked on people, how it didn't make them bad, exactly just smaller than they could have been, and how some of them, when the fear had passed, tried to find their way back. He told Evelyn that evening. She listened, then said, "He'll testify if we need him." "You think so?" "He rode 4 miles to apologize to a man he's afraid of disappointing," she said. "Yes, I think he'll testify." The heat broke something in the valley the following week. Not with rain. Rain would have been a mercy. Instead, on a Tuesday that began like every other day that August, the temperature climbed past anything Caleb could remember and sat there, hard and airless, and total, like the sky had become a lid on a pot. By noon, 3 of the cattle in the west pasture were down. They got 2 back up. The 3rd didn't make it. Caleb worked alongside Pete and Tom through the afternoon, moving the herd, redistributing the water, adjusting the shade structures they'd rigged near the creek bed. It was brutal work in brutal heat, and he pushed himself harder than he should have, because pushing himself had always been the answer, and he didn't have another one. He didn't realize Evelyn wasn't in the house until Pete said in the early evening when they were walking back from the pasture, "I haven't seen Mrs. Morgan since noon." Caleb stopped. He went into the house. She wasn't in the kitchen, not in the sitting room, not in her bedroom. He found her in the barn. She was on the ground beside the heifer with the stone bruise, the one she'd diagnosed and tended for 2 weeks, and she was not moving the way a person moved when they were resting. She was on her side, her notebook still in her hand, her hair loose, her breathing shallow and wrong. Caleb was on his knees beside her before he'd finished crossing the barn floor. "Evelyn," He put his hand on her face and felt it, the heat that was different from the day's heat, the internal burning that had nothing to do with the summer. "Evelyn, look at me." Her eyes opened. They were not entirely focused. "The heifer's water," she said, which made no sense. "I've got her," he said. "Come on." He got her to the house. He got her to her bed. Pete was in the doorway, and Caleb said without turning around, "Ride for the doctor, right now." Pete went. He came back 4 hours later alone. "Creeks flooded the South Road," Pete said, which was the particular cruelty of drought country, that the first real water in weeks had come fast and hard in the hills and rushed into the low road in a wall rather than a gentle rain, and the road to town was not passable before morning at the earliest. "Doc Harmon says he'll come first light if it clears. He gave me what he had, fever powders, willow bark, clean cloth. He walked me through what to do." Caleb stood in the hall outside Evelyn's door. "First light," he said. "Yes, sir." He sent Pete to manage the evening rotation. He went into Evelyn's room. The fever had risen while Pete rode. She was conscious mostly, but drifting in and out of the sharp, clear awareness that was normal for her. She'd say something precise and then lose the thread of it. She asked once what temperature it was outside. She asked once whether the west pasture rotation had been completed. She asked once, her voice very quiet and stripped of its usual composure. "Is someone here?" "I'm here," he said. She settled. He stayed. He didn't know how to nurse a fever. He knew the practical parts, the cool cloth, the water, the powders Pete had brought. He did all of those things with the same methodical focus he brought to fence lines and water channels, because it was the only way he knew how to be useful, and he needed very badly to be useful right now. But beyond the practical parts, he was in unfamiliar territory, and he managed it the way he managed most unfamiliar territory, which was to be very still and pay close attention. Around midnight, when she was restless and her breathing was too fast, he picked up the book from her bedside table. One of the ones she'd brought from Chicago, a collection of essays densely annotated in her small handwriting. He opened it somewhere in the middle. He read aloud. He was not a natural reader of essays. The language was formal, and the arguments were layered in ways that required the kind of sustained attention he usually reserved for land surveys and cattle records. He stumbled over 3 words in the first paragraph. He went back and corrected himself each time. He kept going. He didn't know whether she could hear him, but her breathing slowed slightly, and her hands, which had been moving against the blanket with the restless motion of fever, stilled. So he kept reading. Sometime around 2 in the morning, she said his name. Not the way she usually said it, measured, deliberate. This version was unguarded, the way people were in fever or sleep when the managing fell away. "I'm here," he said. "Don't," she started. Then she lost it. "Don't what?" he said. "Don't go," she said. It was the most undefended thing she had ever said to him. It came from somewhere below all the competence and the precision and the careful earned self-sufficiency. It came from the same place the fear had come from, the fear she never showed, the knowledge that people left, that welcome could be withdrawn, that the things you counted on could become the things you lost. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. She didn't respond. She had already gone back under. He sat in the chair beside her bed. He did not sleep. Doc Harmon arrived before 7 the next morning, as soon as the road was passable. He examined Evelyn, confirmed heat exhaustion compounded by an infection she'd apparently been managing for several days without mentioning to anyone, and gave Caleb a look that contained the specific, calibrated judgment of a man who had seen frontier people push past their limits enough times to recognize the pattern. "She should have said something days ago," Harmon said. "I know," Caleb said. "She'll be all right," Harmon said. "But she needs 3 days of rest and a full week of reduced activity. In this heat, if she'd gone another day—" He let that sit. "She'll argue with you about the rest." "I know that too," Caleb said. Harmon left medicine and instructions and rode back before the heat peaked again. Caleb went back to her room. She was awake, properly awake, her eyes clear, her focus restored, the particular quality of full present attention that was unmistakably her. She looked at him in the doorway, and then looked at the chair beside the bed, the chair that held the impression of a night spent in it. "You stayed," she said. "Yes," he said. She looked at the book on the side table, picked up, placed back the spine, slightly more worn than it had been. "Did you read to me?" she said. "Some," he said. "Which essay?" "3 of them," he said. The one about civic virtue was longer than it needed to be. Something crossed her face that might have been a smile if she'd let it go all the way. She didn't, but it was close. "How long?" she said. "All night." The something like a smile didn't go anywhere. It stayed at the edge of her expression, held there, while she looked at him with the eyes that always saw more than he was prepared for. "The doctor says 3 days rest," Caleb said. "I heard him," she said. "You'll do it." "Caleb." 3 days, he said. Non-negotiable. She looked at him. He looked back. He was not going to lose this one, and she could see that, and after a moment she said, "Fine. 3 days," with the precise tone of someone conceding a battle they've already calculated doesn't affect the war. He brought her water. He brought her the fever powder in a cup, and watched her drink it with the expression of someone who found the taste personally offensive but was willing to be pragmatic about it. He brought her bread when she said she was hungry, which she said about an hour later, with the slightly aggressive practicality of a woman who viewed illness as an administrative inconvenience rather than anything requiring emotional processing. In the afternoon, when the fever had dropped and she was stable, she said, "What did I say last night when the fever was high?" He was at the window. He turned. "Don't go," he said. The silence in the room was very complete. She looked at the ceiling for a moment, then at him. Her voice when she spoke was careful and lower than usual. "I don't remember saying it." "I know," he said. "But She stopped. "You don't have to explain it," he said. "I want to," she said. She held his gaze. "I've spent a long time making sure I didn't need anyone to stay. Making sure that whether they stayed or left, I had already accounted for both and could manage either." She paused. "I stopped believing it was something I got to want." The room was very quiet. "I didn't leave," he said. "No," she said. "You didn't." He crossed to the chair and sat down. Not at the window. Here beside her where he'd sat all night. "When Pete came back without the doctor," he said, "and I went back in and your breathing was wrong. You weren't tracking." He stopped. He was not a man who narrated his own fear, not ever, but he owed her this. "I was afraid," he said. She looked at him steadily. "I've been afraid twice in my life," he said. "When my father died, and I didn't know if I could run this place. And last night." He said it plainly without dressing it up, because the only way he knew how to say hard, true things was directly. That's the difference between 3 weeks ago and now. She was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was not entirely steady, which was the rarest thing he had ever heard from her. "That scares me more than anything else," she said. "I know," he said. "Me too." She looked at him. He looked back. And in the space between them, in that small ordinary room, in a ranch house in Montana, in the dead of summer, with the heat pressing down outside, and the sound of Pete and Tom working the afternoon rotation in the distance, something that had been building for 5 weeks arrived at its destination without ceremony or announcement, the way real things often did. He reached across and put his hand over hers on the blanket. Not a gesture of ownership, not a gesture of relief, a gesture of 2 people who had stopped pretending they were only practical about each other. She turned her hand and held his. They stayed like that for a while without speaking, and outside the cattle moved in the pasture, and the creek ran its lowered course, and the Montana summer heat did what it always did, which was press down on everything, without mercy, and wait to see what survived. The twist came from Pete at 5:30, delivered in the doorway in Pete's careful voice with Pete's careful expression. "Letter came up from Mill Haven," Pete said. "Ryder brought it special from Helena." Caleb came to the doorway. He took the letter. He read it. Then he read it again because the first time he wasn't sure he'd understood it correctly. He had. "What is it?" Evelyn said from the bed. He came back in and sat down. He looked at her. "Whitmore withdrew the claim," he said. She stared at him. "Full withdrawal filed yesterday with the Helena office," he said. "No conditions, no counteroffer." He looked at the letter again. "Our lawyer says he's never seen a claim pulled this cleanly this fast. He thinks someone put significant pressure on Whitmore to drop it." "Who?" she said. Caleb looked at the second section of the letter. "The County Review Board for August 15th, he said. "It's been postponed." "Why?" "Because," he said slowly, reading the lawyer's careful language, "a formal complaint has been filed against Holt Granger for misrepresentation to county officials and coercion of signatures on a public petition." He looked up. "Filed by 3 landowners, including Dale Whitson." Evelyn's hand tightened slightly against his. "Whitson went to the board," she said. "Whitson went to the board," he confirmed. "And apparently he brought 2 others with him. The review isn't cancelled, it's been reopened as a broader inquiry. Granger's the subject now, not us." The room held the weight of that for a moment. "Whitmore pulled out because Granger's position collapsed," Evelyn said. She was thinking it through, that fast, precise processing running even from a sickbed. Without Granger's leverage, Whitmore had no local connection and no cover. A federal civil claim pursued alone against a woman who's now legally Mrs. Morgan in a territory it was too exposed. "That's how I read it," Caleb said. She leaned her head back against the pillow. She was tired, genuinely tired in a way she never let herself be when she was upright, and the relief moving through her face was something he'd never seen there before, unguarded and complete. "It's not over," he said. "The inquiry's still coming. Granger still has resources, and he's cornered now, which makes him unpredictable." "I know," she said. "But tonight it can be over." He looked at her. "Just for tonight," she said. "Let it be finished for tonight." He understood that. The way a person needed sometimes to put something down long enough to breathe. He had carried enough things alone to understand what it cost to carry them and what it meant to set them down. "All right," he said. "Tonight it's done." She closed her eyes. He stayed in the chair. The evening came on slowly, the way summer evenings did in Montana, the heat finally releasing its grip degree by degree, the light going from white to gold, the sound of the ranch settling into its nighttime rhythms. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called once and went quiet. He picked the book back up. "You don't have to," she said without opening her eyes. "I know," he said. He found his place from the night before, and started reading, his voice low and slightly rough around the formal language, correcting himself when he stumbled, going on when he didn't. He was not good at this. He was learning. Her breathing evened out. He kept reading. Evelyn was on her feet on the second day. Not fully. She made it to the kitchen table, where she sat down with slightly less control than she would have preferred, and immediately reached for her notebook, which Caleb had been keeping at a deliberate distance of 4 feet as a matter of principle. He moved it another 4 feet when she sat down. "Caleb," she said. "Doctor said 3 days," he said. He put a cup of tea in front of her. "That was yesterday." "I'm better." "You're better than you were when you were on the barn floor," he said. "That's a low standard." She looked at him with the expression she used when she was deciding whether an argument was worth the energy. She looked at the tea. She picked up the tea. "Fine," she said. "But I want to know everything that happened yesterday." He told her. The cattle count from the morning rotation, 1 more lost in the night, the others holding. Pete's assessment of the West pasture. A message from their Helena lawyer confirming that the county inquiry had been rescheduled to the 28th of August. 12 days. 12 days is enough, she said. For what, he said. For me to be fully recovered, and for us to build the case presentation. She wrapped both hands around the cup. The documentation we have is solid. What we need now is the narrative, how we present it to the board. Facts alone don't move people. Facts inside a story do. He looked at her. 2 days off her feet, and her mind was already 3 steps ahead again. "You're impossible," he said. He said it without any real force behind it. "Yes," she agreed. "But I'm right." He sat down across from her. "All right," he said. "Tell me what you need." She told him. And for the next hour over tea she drank slowly, and bread she ate without complaint. When he put it in front of her, they built the shape of what August 28th would look like. What documents, in what order, who would speak, and what they would say. How to present the water measurements, so that a county board member with no ranching experience could understand them in 30 seconds. She was methodical and precise, and periodically her hand went to where her notebook would have been, and each time he slid it across the table without comment, and each time she looked at him with something that had moved past the edge of gratitude into something neither of them was ready to name in daylight. Old Birch came on the 4th day unannounced, riding up the road in the afternoon with his wife and a basket that turned out to contain preserved food, and at the bottom a bottle of very good whiskey. "Heard you had trouble," he said, handing Caleb the basket on the porch. "We're managing," Caleb said. Birch nodded. He looked at Evelyn, who had come to the door and was standing with the particular careful uprightness of someone who was not going to show any remaining weakness in front of a neighbor she needed to take seriously. "Mrs. Morgan," he said. "Mr. Birch," she said. "Come in." They sat in the kitchen, the 4 of them and Birch's wife, a quiet, steady woman named Clara, who had the look of someone who had seen enough of frontier life to not be impressed by difficulty. Talked with Evelyn about the drought and the cattle and the way the valley had looked in the drought of '63, which Clara remembered because she had been 14 and her father's herd had gone down to a third. Evelyn listened with the full attention she gave everything, asking questions that Clara clearly hadn't expected and appreciated. Birch waited until the women were deep in it, and then he said to Caleb low, "The inquiry, you know what Granger is going to argue." "Water mismanagement," Caleb said. "He's going to argue more than that now," Birch said. "Word I'm hearing he's going to bring in that the Morgan operation was in financial difficulty before this season. Try to make the case that the land isn't being used efficiently and that water rights attached to an underperforming operation should be reassigned." Caleb was quiet. "Is that true?" Birch asked. Not accusing. Asking. "Last 2 years were hard," Caleb said. "Before the channel, before the feeding adjustments, before—" He stopped. "Before your wife," Birch said. Caleb looked at him. "I'm not saying it to make a point," Birch said. "I'm saying it because Granger knows it and he's going to use it. The board doesn't know your operation from the inside. They're going to see numbers, and if the numbers from before this year look bad, you need something that explains what changed and why it's permanent." He looked at the kitchen, at Evelyn, at Clara, at the order that was evident in everything from the way the table was organized to the papers stacked precisely on the counter. "You've got that. Make sure the board sees it." Caleb nodded once. "Thank you, Birch." "Don't thank me," the old man said. "When?" Granger came 2 days before the inquiry. He rode up alone, which was either an attempt at peaceable conversation or a way of ensuring whatever he said had no witnesses, and Caleb walked out to meet him at the fence with no particular expression and waited. "Morgan," Granger said. He had his pleasant face on the one Caleb had stopped trusting the first week of this whole thing. "I wanted to talk before the 28th. "Talk," Caleb said. Granger leaned on his saddle horn. "This has gone further than it needed to," he said. "The inquiry, the counter filings, the whole business. I think we both know that a prolonged legal proceeding benefits nobody in the valley. Lawyers make money. Ranchers lose time. Say what you're here to say," Caleb said. "I'll withdraw the petition," Granger said. "Full withdrawal inquiry, canceled water rights left as is." He paused. "In exchange for right of first refusal on the Morgan property, if you ever decide to sell." Caleb looked at him. "That's all," Granger said. "A standard agreement, common in business." "This isn't a business," Caleb said. "It's my family's land. Land that was struggling before this season," Granger said. And there was the real edge. Finally, the pleasant face still in place, but the pressure behind it showing through. "I've seen the county records, Morgan. 3 hard seasons, reduced herd size. I'm offering you a way to secure your position in the valley without the risk of an inquiry that might not go the way you're hoping." Caleb said no. "Think about." "I thought about it," Caleb said. "The answer is no. Come back on the 28th if you want to continue this conversation, in front of the board with lawyers present." He turned back toward the house. "Good day, Granger." He walked away without looking back. Evelyn was at the kitchen window. She'd seen the whole thing. When he came in, she didn't ask what Granger had said. She looked at his face and said, "You said no." "I said no." She turned back to her papers. But her chin lifted slightly, that small quiet thing, and he saw it, and this time he let himself see it without looking away. The morning of August 28th, Caleb and Evelyn rode to Millhaven together. Pete came with them. Tom and Ricky stayed on the ranch. Whitson met them at the edge of town, quiet and resolved, with 2 other ranchers whose names Caleb knew, but whose presence on his side he hadn't expected. Birch was already at the county hall when they arrived, seated near the front, with Clara beside him. The room was full. Granger was there with a lawyer from Billings, a sharp-dressed man who held his papers with the particular confidence of someone who had won enough cases to consider winning his natural state. Granger himself sat easily, that smooth pleasantness intact, as if he were attending something mildly entertaining rather than a proceeding he had initiated to take a man's land and water. The board had 3 members. The chairman was a heavy-set man named Comstock, who had administered county affairs for 15 years and had the demeanor of someone who had seen every kind of frontier dispute and been moved by very few of them. Beside him sat a younger man taking notes, and a woman who ran the territorial land registry, and said nothing but missed nothing. The proceeding opened with Granger's case. His Billings lawyer was good. Caleb had to give him that. He built the water mismanagement argument, cleanly cited creek-level data, presented the narrative of an undersized operation drawing more than its sustainable share, and then pivoted exactly as Birch had predicted to the 3-year financial record of the Morgan Ranch. Hard seasons reduced output, the numbers that told a story of decline. He did it all without once saying Caleb Morgan was incompetent. He just laid the facts down and let the room draw the conclusion. When he finished, Comstock looked at the Morgan side of the room. Caleb stood. "I'd like to present our response," he said. "And I'd like to request that my wife present the technical documentation as she compiled it and understands it better than anyone in this room." Comstock looked at Evelyn. The woman from the land registry, the one who missed nothing, leaned slightly forward. "Proceed," Comstock said. Evelyn stood. She was fully recovered. Every ounce of the capability that had been present on the train platform 6 weeks ago was present now, focused, controlled, and brought entirely to bear on the room in front of her. She did not begin with the water measurements. She began with the ranch. She described the Morgan operation as it was 3 years ago, and then as it was this season. Not with apology for the difficult years, but with context, the market conditions, the regional drought patterns, the specific improvements made since her arrival, and the measurable outcomes of each. The channel, the feeding adjustments, the water flow improvement downstream. She had numbers for all of it. She presented them in plain language that required no ranching expertise to follow. Then she addressed the downstream flow data. "The diversion Mr. Granger's men began on July 19th, she said, was 11 feet past the recognized center line of the shared waterway as established in the 1871 Territorial Survey." She set the documentation on the board's table. "I've marked the center line and Mr. Granger's diversion point on this map. The measurement discrepancy is not ambiguous." Granger's lawyer stood. "The survey interpretation is documented in the original filing," Evelyn said without looking at him. She was looking at Comstock. "Which I've also included. Page 6. Comstock found page 6. He read it. He passed it to the land registry woman. She read it. Her expression did not change, but she set it down with a particular deliberateness that said everything about what she'd found in it. Then Whitson testified. He stood, and he told the truth, all of it. Granger's approach in June. The misrepresentation. The coercion after the meeting. He said it plainly, and he said it without looking at Granger, which took a kind of courage that Caleb respected more than he could say in this room. When Whitson sat down, one of the other ranchers who had ridden in with him stood and confirmed the same pattern. A different approach, the same pressure, the same implied threat about water access if he didn't cooperate. Granger's lawyer tried to reframe it as a community concern, expressed through legitimate channels. Comstock stopped him at the third sentence. "The center line question is what we're here to resolve," Comstock said. "The misrepresentation allegation will be addressed separately." He looked at Granger directly for the first time in the proceeding. "Counsel for Mr. Granger, do you dispute the 1871 survey documentation as presented?" A pause. "We request time to review the filing," Granger's lawyer said. "The filing is 16 years old and publicly recorded," Comstock said. He looked at the land registry woman. She said, "The documentation is accurate. The center line as marked is correct." Another pause. Longer this time. Comstock said, "The petition filed by Mr. Granger is dismissed. Morgan water rights as established are confirmed. The matter of misrepresentation in the petition process will be referred for separate review." He closed his folder. "We're adjourned." The room shifted that particular movement of a crowd when a thing has been decided and people were processing what it meant. Granger stood. He and his lawyer spoke quietly. Then Granger looked across the room at Caleb, not at the board, not at Evelyn. At Caleb specifically, with an expression that had finally dropped the pleasantness entirely and showed what was underneath, which was the flat, cold look of a man who had played a long game and lost, and was already calculating the next one. Caleb held his gaze for a moment. Then he turned away first. Not from weakness, because Granger had stopped being the most important thing in the room. Evelyn was gathering papers. He crossed to her and stood beside her, and she looked up at him, and what was in her face was not triumph. It was something quieter and more real than that. The particular relief of a person who had carried something heavy for a long time and had just been allowed to set it down. "It's done," he said. "Yes," she said. Pete clapped Caleb on the shoulder hard enough to require balance adjustment. Birch shook his hand. Whitson, who had come over with his hat in his hands again, the posture of a man making another kind of accounting, said, "Morgan, I'm glad it came right." Caleb looked at him. "So am I," he said. And he meant it simply without extra weight, because the man had done what mattered when it mattered, and that was the measure Caleb had always used. They rode home in the late afternoon light, all four of them, Caleb and Evelyn, side by side, Pete just behind. Nobody said much. The valley spread out around them, dry and vast, and still the creek running low and the grass thin on the western slope, but holding the cattle visible in the distance doing what cattle did, moving, grazing, alive. "The inquiry about the misrepresentation," Evelyn said after a while. "That's going to take time." "Yes," Caleb said. "Granger isn't finished," she said. "No," he said. "But we are, for tonight." She looked at him sideways. "Just for tonight," he said, with just enough of a smile that she caught it. She faced forward again. But she was smiling too, and she let it go all the way this time. 2 weeks later, at the end of August, the rains finally came. Not a wall of flash water. Genuine rain, slow, steady, 2 days of it that sank into the ground and reached the creek and raised it 4 inches overnight. Caleb stood on the porch and listened to it on the roof, and for the first time in months, he felt the particular ease in his chest of a man whose land was getting what it needed. Inside, Evelyn was at the table. She had her notebook, her tea, the books spread around her. Normal. Her version of normal, which had become without him noticing exactly when the baseline against which he measured whether the house felt right. He came inside. He stood in the kitchen doorway. "It's raining," he said. "I can hear it," she said without looking up. "The creek will be up by morning." "Good." She turned a page. He crossed to the table. He sat down beside her, not across from her the way he'd sat at the beginning, but beside her the way he'd been sitting since the night of the fever. She didn't comment on it. Neither did he. It was simply where he sat now. He put his hand on the table. She looked at it. Then she put her hand over his. They stayed like that for a moment. The rain on the roof, the lamp lit between them, the papers and the books and the notebooks that documented every decision they'd made together spread across the table that had started as his and was now theirs. "Evelyn," he said. "Yes," she said. "I need to say something," he said, "and I'm not good at this, so I'm going to say it plainly, and you're going to tell me if I've got it wrong." She looked at him with her full, steady attention. "When you got off that train," he said, "I thought I understood what I'd sent for. Someone practical, someone useful, someone who'd make the work easier." He paused. "I was right about all of that. But I was right about it the way a man is right about a river when all he's ever seen is the surface of it." He met her eyes. "I didn't know what I was getting. I don't think I can explain what I mean by that in a way that does it justice. But I know that this ranch, this life, is not what it was 2 months ago. And that's not the channel, or the feeding ratios, or the water rights." He stopped, held her gaze. "It's you. It's who you are. And I don't want to go back to what this was before." The rain came down on the roof. The lamp burned steady. Evelyn was quiet for a moment, that full measuring silence she gave things that deserved it. "You stayed all night," she said, "when I was sick." "Yes," he said. "You read to me from an essay about civic virtue that was longer than it needed to be." "Yes," he said. "It really was." Something moved through her face, real and warm and entirely unguarded, the version of her that lived underneath all the competence and the self-sufficiency and the careful management of what she let show. It was the version he had first seen in the fever, and then again in the county hall, and then in glimpses since, and each time he saw it he understood more clearly that it was not a different person from the one who had walked off the train and told him his boots were wrong. It was the same person, just trusted enough to be fully present. "I'm not going anywhere, Caleb Morgan," she said. "I told you that." "I know you did," he said. "I meant it then," she said. "I mean it more now." He looked at her. "Me too," he said. She leaned forward and rested her forehead against the side of his face. Not dramatic, not performed, just a person letting themselves be close to another person without keeping the distance that survival had required of her for so long. He brought his other hand up and held her there, and they were still for a moment in the way people were still when they had stopped bracing for what came next. Then she straightened. She picked up her pen. "The east pasture rotation schedule," she said. "After the rain, the grass recovery on the west slope should—" "Tomorrow," he said. She looked at him. "Tomorrow," he said again, firmly. She set the pen down. "Fine," she said. "Tomorrow." He stood. He went to the stove and put water on for tea. She sat at the table and didn't reach for the notebook, which was from her a statement. After a while she said, "Caleb." "Yeah," he said. "When Birch came, when he told you about Granger's plan to argue the financial record." She paused. "You knew he was right, about the difficult years." "Yes," he said. "You weren't going to say it," she said. "At the hearing. You were going to let it sit there, the hard years, without explaining them." He was quiet. "Why?" she said. He thought about it, really thought about it, standing at the stove with his back to her. "Because the hard years were mine," he said finally. "My failure to manage things better than I did. And I was—" He stopped. "I was afraid that if I explained them by pointing to what changed after you came, it would sound like I was using you, giving you credit to serve my argument." She was very still. "So I was going to take the hit," he said, "and let the documentation carry us." The silence lasted long enough to be its own kind of conversation. "That might be," she said slowly, "the most decent thing anyone has ever nearly done for me." He turned around. She was looking at him with everything she had, which was more than most people had, and it was all pointed directly at him. "Nearly," he said. "Birch fixed it," she said, "and I presented it differently than you would have." A pause. "But you were going to carry it yourself, so I didn't have to be an explanation." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. She already knew. "Caleb," she said. "Yeah. I love this ranch," she said. "I love the work of it, the irrigation and the cattle and the county filings and the drought calculations at midnight." She held his gaze. "And I love the man who built it, and who is building it still, and who stayed up all night reading civic virtue essays when the roof was falling in." Her voice was steady and certain and completely without qualification. "I love you. I think I have for longer than I've admitted, even to myself." The rain came down on the roof. The lamp burned between them. He crossed the kitchen. He sat down beside her again. "Close this time." And he looked at her, this woman who had stepped off a train with 2 suitcases and a violin, and a mind that had outpaced every expectation he'd ever had. And he said, "I wasn't going anywhere either." It was the truest thing he'd said in a long time. Outside, the rain continued. The creek rose through the night. The cattle stood in the pasture and received the water that the land had been waiting months for. And in the morning, the grass would begin to come back, and the work would continue. The way work always did on a ranch that intended to survive, hard, daily, necessary, and shared. The violin played at sunset from then on, every evening. The sound of it moving through the ranch house and out across the land past the fence lines and the creek and the recovering pasture, until the neighbors who heard it from a distance said the Morgan place had changed, and they were right, though they couldn't have said exactly how. The change was this: a man who had built his life around survival had finally learned the difference between surviving alone and building something worth surviving for. And a woman who had crossed half a country to find a life she could claim as her own had found it not in spite of the hard land and the harder seasons, but exactly there in the precise center of all of it, beside a man who had stayed when staying was the most difficult and the most necessary thing. He had thought he was ordering a wife. What arrived was the person who taught him what it meant to build something that lasted not with contracts or arrangements or careful negotiations, but with the daily, unspectacular, irreplaceable choice to stay.